For those that are online, do you want to give a brief rundown of what we're doing today?
Yeah, so today we will basically be focusing on the protected areas that are predominantly in the dry zone, but with a slight focus on the intermediate zone protected areas as well. So it's basically everything in between the southwestern wet zone, lowland wet zone that we talked about last time, as well as the protected areas south of Yala National Park. So basically the Uva Province, the Ampara District, the Southern Province.
Yeah.
Yeah, bring the map up.
All right. So.
Yeah, so as you can see on the map, we'll be talking about that area, the Greater Yala Complex, and then everything between Udawalawe, Hambantota, to Bogahapalesa, south of the Central Highlands, and everything east of the Lowland Wet Zone. So it's quite an expansive area with a lot of national parks.
Up to about that end where Kumana is, across here, down to Udawalawe, and then into this.
And then back down and around, yeah. That would be the rough draft of it.
Okay. So, give it about, a few more minutes and then start.
Yeah, give it another 2-3 minutes and then let's go.
Yeah, and just to add to what you were saying, basically the 6 national parks within that area, and then also adding on to that, the buffer zones, corridors, as well as all the other reserves and environmental protected areas, sanctuaries that fall under this region. And now we've got quite a few people, we can start.
Yeah, so just to bear in mind for those who have just joined, again, despite the fact that most of the well-known national parks are in this area, we still have a load of Department of Forest Conservation protected areas and a few Central Environmental Authority ones as well. So we will try and cover as much as possible on that today.
Okay. Well, like you said, so when you talk about this area, what people will know is Yala and Udawalawe has been 2 of the main visited parks.
Yeah.
But along with that, there's Kumana, Bundhala, Ulgamvehera, and then also the less known one, Usangala.
Yeah.
So there are the 6 national parks, but also there are all these other connections between these national parks and protected areas around it, is what we would be focusing on because of the importance of them to the national parks. And the fact that people already do know more about the national parks than the other protected areas.
Yeah,
so that's right.
And it's interesting now. I noticed Bundhala has joined as well. So he is somebody who can actually verify this quite well. Even when it comes to Yala National Park, which is a protected area, specifically a national park, tier 2, that everybody knows, most people tend to view Yala as simply Block 1, which is 140 square kilometers. And that's interesting because Block 1 of Yala National Park is actually the 4th smallest of the 5 blocks. And even more recently, you've had people coming to Yala Block 5 on safari occasionally. Even that remains the smallest block of Yala at 75 square kilometers. So it's an interesting paradigm to find that the 3 biggest blocks of Yala are still the most pristine and have virtually no visitation, yet the smallest ones are the ones where most of the visitors are. I would say 95% of the visitation goes between blocks 1 and 5. And I think you would agree with that as well.
The key there is the fact that Yala Block 1 is the most visited park in Sri Lanka, or visited part of the park.
Yeah, visited block, yeah.
So, yeah, and now, like you said, Block 5 has become more and more famous. And I think it's more to do with the habituation of the animals in those areas, because everyone seems to be happy when they are able to see animals up close. Yeah. And that is why these have become that famous, as Yala is known as the land of the leopard, yeah?
Yeah.
So, also, I think the key distinction we have to make is the fact that Yala Block 2, that isn't the nature reserve. While there's a strict nature reserve next to Yala Block 2. Lots of people do make that mistake. So do you want to clarify that as well? John got stuck.
Yeah, sorry. Just got cut out for a second. Yeah, so you were saying.
Yeah, so the fact that the strict nature reserve and Block 2 are 2 separate. And do you want to clarify on that? So just give us
Yes, so you see, the thing about Yala National Park Block 2 is that Yala Block 2 is actually one of the most dangerous areas in Yala due to the isolation and general lack of habituation when it comes to wilderness areas. So there's a reason why they have certain protocols in place, specifically the Department of Wildlife Conservation, to ensure that those who go into Block 2 are prepared. You know, you have to go up with backup food and medical supplies. You have to usually go and camp for one night, or it has to be a full day trip. And you have to go with 2 or 3 vehicles given the climatic conditions. But that does not mean that it is the strict nature reserve. The strict nature reserve is a separate 220 square kilometer protected area that is independent of Yala National Park Block 2.
I think where the doubt does come in is the fact that you do have to get special permission even to go into Block 2.
Yes.
Whereas the strict nature reserve is one that is not technically visited.
Yeah.
Like you just said, there is the clear distinction, and that's why it's considered the strict nature reserve as well. So that is why it isn't Block 2. So Yala having 5 blocks, and people only really talking about Block 1, and now more recently Block 5, like we were saying.
And also, I think this is a good time to mention just the fact that there is a lot of misinformation regarding Yala National Park and its blocks. Now, I saw there was a comment previously by the Aimless Albatross asking if Block 1 is on the Katagamo side. And just to clarify that for you, Block 1 of Yala National Park actually has 2 entrances. You have the main entrance and park headquarters at Palutupana, and you have the secondary entrance at Katagamo, which has a range office there. So, no, Block 5 would not technically be at Katagamo. Block 5 would actually be at Galge Veheragala, which is almost 30 kilometers north of the Katagamo area, which is the secondary entrance of Block 1. So I think it's just something to touch on, that there is a lot of misinformation, and that's something that should be addressed, I think, at some point.
Yeah, so the Block 5 entrance does fall on the B35, which is probably John's favorite road. Yeah, so that road does cut across blocks 3 and 5 and 4 on the lower end. So that is where that boundary does come. So roads are probably the best boundary in this area, and that is another thing we were going to touch on. The fact that the road networks do create problems for these protected areas and movement of animals through these protected areas in this zone specifically. So did you want to say anything about your favorite road while we're
Well, that's the thing. You see, it's all well and good that these roads are cutting across protected areas, but from a legal perspective, they shouldn't really be. You see, the whole point is to have protected areas that are fairly unbroken in terms of being contiguous with each other. And the problem is, once you put a B or A class road across a protected area, then you run the risk of rampant pollution, collisions with wildlife. You know, that's a key part of the human-wildlife conflict overall, and just general chaos that is caused by having a A or B class road cut across a protected area.
And adding on to that, with these roads, that's when the encroachment does happen, because people do like living along these well-maintained roads, because it does create that ease of access as such. So that is where all these road networks and just the way the land use plans do come into effect is what we were talking about earlier. So that is where these roads, like we were talking about, have to be better planned, and how they cut across these different protected areas. Yeah. So
and I honestly think it is really something that should be addressed in the strictest sense. So, for example, I know in the West and in certain other countries, there are wildlife corridors that are actually created over these protected areas, you know, as opposed to cutting directly across them and causing ecological damage that can't be, you know, restored in immediate proximity. So there's a good example to this, actually. Most people wouldn't realize this, but everybody assumes that Lunugambera National Park is this wild elephant corridor that allows the facilitation of ecological movement between Udawalawe and Yala National Parks. But the actual fact of the matter is, without a certain nature reserve called Vetahirikanda, there would not be a means by which elephants in Udawalawe, or any other example of wildlife for that matter, would make it to Lunugambera and the Great Yala Complex. And just tying into our fact earlier about roads, if you look at the Vetahirikanda Nature Reserve, you have 2 roads cutting across it. You have a B-class road cutting across it on the Udawalawe side, and you have the A2, a big A-class road cutting across it on the Lunugambera side. So again, it all ties back into how we deal with roads and how they affect protected areas.
Yeah, exactly. And like you were saying, this Vetahirikanda, it's a nature reserve, not just a corridor. So it does have that extra bit of protection. But however, like you said, there's the A2 on the east, and on the west, there is the B528.
Exactly.
So, like that, those roads, that causes that disruption. And with those roads, the amount of encroachment. On the east, being an A2 road, there's a lot more encroachment just near that Lunugambera National Park, where it meets that nature reserve, which is Vetahirikanda.
Yeah.
So,
and you know, you have another example of this, which is one that, again, very few people are aware of. Even from northwestern Udawalawe, shall we say, there is a wildlife sanctuary called Dahiyagla, which actually connects and facilitates ecological movement of species between Udawalawe National Park and the Department of Forest Conservation protected areas such as Bogaha Palesa, for example, which is north of Kaltata. And yet again, without these protected areas having these secondary dual purposes as wildlife corridors, they would not be able to function in a proper manner, and there would be a lack of ecological movement. And still, that same B528 that you mentioned cuts across Dahiyagla as well on the way to Kaltata. So.
Yeah, and in addition to the corridor, it does create that extra buffer where the buffer zones cannot, because buffer zones have that, like you were talking about, the buffer zones, they are a basic way of protecting the national park. Whereas these reserves, they actually have more legal backing, and there's more laws that can help protect these national parks. Exactly. So it's that additional protection.
And it's also important to note for our viewers that I know there's been a lot floating around on social media and on the internet regarding protected area buffer zones in Sri Lanka, but there's actually a small catch to that. You see, despite the fact that the current iteration of the Flora and Fauna Protection Ordinance, or FFPO, amended as of 2009, actually states that there should be a 1 mile buffer zone for all DWC protected areas, there's no actual provisions within the existing laws to gazette those into existence. So that is why we have such a tricky time with buffer zones, unfortunately. And in a way, as Riahn said earlier, these other protected areas are actually doing that job as their secondary dual purpose and providing more legal protection than these 1 mile identified buffer zones, which can never be officially gazetted until the laws are amended.
Exactly. So, and also those buffer zones, it's difficult to bring them into effect with the fact of the amount of encroachment happening with these road networks and accessibility. And like we were talking about earlier, there's one proposed buffer zone which is now really affected by this encroachment, and the plausibility of it coming into effect is not as great anymore because of this factor.
Yeah.
So that is where we need to find the way that, because with our government, we need to find a way to deal with them and help extend these protected areas. And just on this map, I'm trying to show what we were talking about. It's this zone, this connection. This is where, into this, from here, where Lunugambahera is, there's this road and another road on this side that creates that divide.
Yeah.
So all of that does come into effect, and there are roads going through. And for people who do know Yala, the Situlpahua road does go through here, and then the Bundhala Sella Kataramgama road that cuts across blocks 3 and 5, and all of that. So that is what we were talking about. So the land use and all the planning and how it can be better into the future is what we are trying to talk about and create that awareness. And that with that awareness comes the fact that we can get more people to help back the need for this protection.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you said, if I can just add on to that, it's actually a very good point, because there has to be an integration of protected areas into proper land use planning on the island. Now, if we take, for example, the eastern sector of the Great Yala Complex, which we refer to as the Kumana sector, there are 3 stunning protected areas on that side. I'm going to quickly give a shout out to the crew at the Parrotfish Collective, who do a lot of fantastic work in that area around Kumana National Park and the Panama Kunimbigla Wildlife Sanctuary. So check them out. It's at Parrotfish Collective if you guys have a moment. But the important point to mention here is that those 3 protected areas provide an incredible refuge for the diversity in that area. And most people don't realize this actually, but Kumana National Park is now our 7th largest national park, 357 square kilometers. It's a big park since it was upgraded from Yala East in 2006. Then you have the Panama Kunimbigla Wildlife Sanctuary, which is another 65 square kilometers. And then you have the mighty Kumbukan Conservation Forest. And the Kumbukan Conservation Forest is one of my favorite protected areas in that area, because it still holds that integral biodiversity array that is needed to make a protected area ecologically viable. And at the same time, as we mentioned earlier, despite the fact that there are roads going here, there, everywhere, it still allows movement from Kumana National Park onto Lahugala Kitulana National Park, and then straight onto the eastern protected areas. So there's a lot to consider, I think, and I'm sure you'd agree with that.
And I would say that's where the fact that when you say Yala, it's not just block 1, it's all of this surrounding that as well. So
exactly.
Everyone, when you say Yala, they talk about block 1. But now, like you mentioned, there's all this other importance towards the east of Yala, which they consider block 1, and then towards block 2 and further upwards into Kumana. So all that is still connected, and there isn't as much damage that has happened there. which is what we need to try and protect. And that's where the strict nature reserve also does come into effect.
Yeah, absolutely. And even from that point of view, I think it's also important to note that already we've had quite a bit of damage in some of these protected areas. So, for example, if we take the Viravila Tissamaharama Wildlife Sanctuary, that actually started out as quite a pristine dry zone, dry evergreen forest ecosystem with a bit of deconthorn scrub forest around the edges. But unfortunately now there has been so much encroachment into the Viravila Tissamaharama Wildlife Sanctuary that it actually doesn't exist except on paper anymore, which is a bit of a shame. There's a bit of a protected catchment area around the two reservoirs in that area. But aside from that, that protected area has pretty much been wiped off the map. And that should give us a sense of urgency to protect these remaining protected areas because they are under threat. Make no mistake about that.
Yeah, and that's where I think I was talking about going towards Kumana, but where else if you move upwards and towards the north west of Yala, Block 1, that is where a lot of the encroachment can be seen, near the Katagamu entrance and along the Situlpawa Road and where the A2 and the Bundhala Road goes across. Exactly. So that is where this road network and the planning needs to be better examined as such. And also, maybe now that these roads have come into effect and they are already there, when people do use them, having laws, because what you're actually doing is you're going across a protected area. So technically, where you're getting a permit might be a stretch, but there should be laws against people doing illegal stuff that would not be allowed in the national parks, because you are driving through these protected areas. And that is
not just that,
which is best known in the Bundhala Selakatragama comes into effect, and we can talk about it from here on.
No, and not just that. It's also that the Department of Wildlife Conservation has to be empowered to enforce these regulations, because otherwise people can get away scot-free or with just a slap on the wrist, and then it becomes an impossible task to actually keep these under control. In fact, I can think of one very good example is the road that cuts across Bundhala National Park and the Bundhala Wilmana Wildlife Sanctuary. That road, even now, I have had instances where you get herds of elephants crossing back and forth between the wildlife sanctuary on your left-hand side and the national park on your right-hand side when you're heading towards Kirinda. And yet, for some reason, you also find people on bikes. You know, we have visitors from abroad who actually come on scooters and actually traversing that road in the evening when these elephants are out and about. So I think there needs to be a lot more to raise awareness on where roads cut across protected areas. That is a vital part of this.
Exactly. That's where the land use planning does come into effect. You can't put a road wherever you want, and that's where EIAs and all of those things will come into effect. But because we're talking about these protected areas and creating more awareness about them, we won't go into detail on those. But like you said, and we know from when we drove back from Yala one time back to Colombo in the middle of the night, we found an elephant in the middle of nowhere where we wouldn't have expected. And that on a road, and it had already wandered through all these fences. And for them, going through the fences, they follow their own path and that what they're used to. And the disruption that we've caused is what is leading to the human-animal conflict.
Absolutely.
And also, we try to create that habituation where we are feeding them and doing the wrong things. And that, again, is another thing we should talk about and create awareness about not doing those wrong things.
Yeah. And also maybe just letting people know that when you approach a wild elephant, even if it's in the safety of, or what you think is the safety of the vehicle, there are certain things that you should and should not do. Because ultimately, if a wild elephant is angry enough and big enough, it will demolish your vehicle. Make no mistake about that. There is no messing with a wild elephant in Sri Lanka.
Definitely. Exactly that. Because we know from videos, and when you see Gamunu in Yala, it's just, a vehicle is almost nothing for them. They can throw it over if they want. But the fact is, they're coming looking for food. And because of the fact that they've been habituated, it's not their fault in the end of it. But in the end, we do look at it as their fault because we can't seem to find fault in ourselves.
No, I know.
That's the sad part.
And yet this also ties back nicely into the protected area management that we're talking about. Because ultimately, if you habituate wild elephants and cause problems, then eventually they will either get shot at or they will get put into one of these so-called wild elephant prisons. And then you lose an integral part of that wild elephant population. And I don't think that's something we should ever let happen.
Definitely. And moving on, we can talk about Bundhala being in this area. Bundhala is one of the first RAMSAR listed wetland in Sri Lanka, and it is home to thousands of birds. And it is a hotspot for birders. And it is one of the most important wetlands in this zone because this does fall into the dry zone. And just that, the protection it caused and the amount of migratory birds that do fly into Bundhala, that being so important, but the destruction, like you said earlier, there's a road going straight through. Allowing these things to happen, where the land use management has to come into better effect. And that is where, towards the future, we have to come up with a plan using our different departments and coming up with a plan to protect these areas while we develop for humans.
Absolutely. And not just that, if I can just direct the audience's attention to the ecological significance of having this avifaunal diversity, it makes Bundhala probably the best place, or one of the best places, aside from maybe the Vankalai Marine Wildlife Sanctuary in the northwest, for coming to Sri Lanka and going on a birding tour. I know for a fact that there are birders who spend weeks in Sri Lanka going to certain specific protected areas just looking for birds. And when it comes to the southern dry zone, the first destination that most birders stop at is Bundhala National Park. So that should just give everyone an idea of how ecologically significant it is. Not to mention the fact that you get enormous saltwater crocodiles in Bundhala National Park still. So that also adds a pretty nice touch to the reptilian aspect of it.
And then moving further to the west, we get Udawalawe, which is another of the well-known parks in this area. And people recognize Udawalawe as a big grassland of the Walawe. And it's more than that. Udawalawe stretches up into the north and it becomes nice forested area. But no one seems to know this because they haven't had the chance to visit it. And do you want to talk about that a bit more in detail?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I don't know whether anybody in this chat may have gone to this area, but there's actually a secondary entrance to Udawalawe in the northwestern part of the park at Handagiri, which is actually interesting because it provides you with a view of how Udawalawe originally looked, long before there were villages that turned the rest of Udawalawe into the grasslands that we see today, and long before there was human intervention that resulted in all the invasive species taking over that park. The secondary entrance at Handagiri is a remarkable place. You get these tall, thick, dry zone dry evergreen forests, like you would in, for example, Yala Block 3 or Wilpattu. Yet, unlike those two other parks, they are filled with wild elephants, and there's even rumors that there are still leopards and sloth bears in northern Udawalawe. So it's a very, very different ecosystem. I'm sure you can elaborate more on that as well, based on your last trip there.
Yeah, no, it's definitely. If you go and check some of the pictures, it's a beautiful place, and you do see elephants. And seeing elephants in those forested areas, there's a difference, and there's a beauty in itself to that. And also, like you said, Yala Block 3, another less spoken about part of Yala, is also covered in these beautiful forested areas, which you would associate with Wilpattu. But again, within this zone, you get those type of areas, and that is another important factor about talking about protected areas and promoting them. Because in the end, it is the visitation that does provide the ability to protect these protected areas through visitation and getting funding. And then that way the DWC and the DFC can enhance their protection and how they collaborate together and work together to create protection.
And even more added on to that point, it brings me to another national park that is in this cluster of protected areas, Lunugambera National Park.
Yes.
And Lunugambera has particularly weak national park management as far as the DWC is concerned. But I do feel that Lunugambera is one of those national parks that has some serious untapped potential in terms of wild elephants, avian fauna, and just general biodiversity that remains fairly undiscovered due to the fact that very few people visit that national park. And it's interesting because a lot of the time when people say Lunugambera, everybody assumes Yala Block 5. And then when you say Yala Block 5, people assume Lunugambera. So it becomes a bit of a confusing scenario. So people are wondering which one is which. And one thing I want to clarify on that is, yes, the main entrance for Yala Block 5 at Galgave Hirugale is also the rear entrance for Lunugambera. But unlike Block 5 of Yala, which only has 2 entrances, Lunugambera National Park actually has 6 official entrances that are open to the general public. And as such, you can technically enter from any part of Lunugambera National Park and go into Block 5 from where you started. But of course, you would have to exit back out of Lunugambera because they don't allow crossing parks because it makes for visitor management. It makes visitor management a bit tricky, shall I say. But regardless, Lunugambera National Park is one of those parks that I think should be visited more. And even if you were to visit from Yala Block 5, one thing I would recommend is if you have had your fill of leopards and your fill of sloth bears, if you're lucky enough to come across them, When you are in Block 5, cross the Manik River and cross the spill gates at Behirgal, at the reservoir. And once you do that, you are inside Lunugambera National Park. That is the official boundary. The Manik River and the Behirgal Reservoir spill gates. That is the boundary between Lunugambera National Park and Yala Block 5. So if you cross from one to the other, keep in mind that you are entering two very different sets of ecosystems and two very different national parks, which you are very well aware of, I'm sure, Riahn.
Yeah. And leading from that into the fact that that's one place where you can see this unbroken connection, and that allows the free movement of the different fauna. And that is a connection that needs to be created, but with these road networks, it's difficult.
Yeah.
However, it is still possible because the fact, like we were saying earlier, on the way back from Yala, we saw elephants in the middle of almost nowhere. There was no protected areas in the region, and they'd walk through farm area. So they do find a way, and they can. It's just educating humans and how to deal with it, and how we can better understand what we should do if we come across that situation. And things like that. That's where creating awareness, talking to people, educating them, and knowing how to deal with these situations is also important.
And not just that, it's also about identifying the corridors that these wild elephants travel. Now, if we take the area north of Lunugambera National Park, the Center for Conservation Research, or CCR, is actually doing some good work in that area. Because in that area, there are a couple of DFC protected areas, such as Tunkamahela, there's Wadina Helia, there's proposed Demalia Kuda Oya. All these are big DFC protected areas, relatively speaking, that still contain large numbers of elephants. And one of the things that we're trying to look at in that area is actually getting those DFC protected areas, which are quite isolated now, connected back to the rest of the protected area network. And that ties into, again, what you said earlier. We need to identify the patterns of ecological movement for all species. Yes, elephants and other terrestrial big five are keystone species. But once you get those corridors up and running, then all species can move throughout the network in a fairly safe manner without having to worry too much.
That goes back to my point, which I was saying earlier. Elephants seem to remember, and they create their corridors. So if we can identify those corridors, and elephants being one of the larger mammals, if they can move through, all the other species can use those corridors. Because if you can find a space large enough and figure out which movement patterns they do have, we can figure it out through different research methods. And then from there, come up with the protected area network, and then all other fauna, like you just said, would move through that, which is very important. And tying into that, we can talk about Kumana a bit more, because that is another important place in this region.
Yeah.
And you want to talk about Kumana because you like.
Yeah, so Kumana is always one of those national parks, sort of like Vasagamua for me, that has always been a big part of my life since I was a kid. And I think one of the reasons Kumana is so fantastic as an ecosystem is that it combines coastal ecosystems, thick dry zone dry evergreen forests, the riverine forests of the Kumbukan Oya, and a couple of other varied ecosystems that actually create a unique landscape that I don't think you can technically find anywhere else. There isn't any other landscape that is like Kumana. Not to mention the fact that terrestrial big five in Kumana, the sightings, you have to have a little patience. The wildlife isn't necessarily as habituated as Yala. But when you do see examples of wildlife, some of the best sightings I've had in my life of leopards, elephants, sloth bear, even true wild water buffalo, there is actually a true wild water buffalo population outside Block 2 in Kumana National Park. And Kumana was also declared as a RAMSAR listed wetland cluster in 2013 with the Pana Kurimbinga Wildlife Sanctuary. So for all the bird lovers, all those who like photographing avian fauna, it is a stunning national park, and scenery as well. That also ties nicely into everything.
All right, there's a question up there. Is there a sort of tracking process currently happening in Sri Lanka to find out these parks? Yes, there is a lot of work happening. There are different projects, but that's where the collaboration needs to happen. People need to work together and figure out these things. And like I was saying, you have trackers on elephants and all kinds of things, but it's more than that. It's all these groups working together is more important, I would say. What would you think on that factor?
It's absolutely, because data-driven scientific conservation is actually the best manner in which we can actually achieve something for the protected area network. So bringing all the conservation entities to work with the various government entities that handle these protected areas means that we can actually identify, restore, and create these pathways for the movement of ecological species between protected areas. Because otherwise, once you start cutting off protected areas, then wildlife populations stagnate, there's a deficiency in the genetic diversity, and then it all becomes a big mess ultimately. So I absolutely agree. It's very important, but it has to be scientific and data-driven.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Because you need that scientific backing if you're taking to any type of government entity. You need that scientific backing to give the reason why. So that is the most important part, like you were saying. And I think now we're coming to the end of this session and we should wrap it up.
Yeah.
But for the next session, we will be moving up east past Kumana into Lahogala and all of that area. And do you want to give what to expect next week to the viewers? Do you want to talk about it?
There is, just very briefly, there is a string of protected areas, which I'm not going to spoil too much, that connects all the way from Lahogala Kitulana National Park in the south, right up to in the
Give you it on the map so it helps.
Yeah. So you should be able to see it on the map there. From Lahogala Kitulana in the south, right the way up to some very well-known and slightly less well-known national parks, right past Trincomalee, up to the eastern provincial boundary line. So that's what we will be talking about next time. And I think the final thing that I am just going to leave everybody with is Yala Block 1. I know the conversation about Yala Block 1 and visitation is going to go on. It's a conversation that's been happening for years, and it's likely to go on for years as well. But keep in mind that Block 1 of Yala has actually had quite a few examples of documentation and management plans. Even 2 years ago, the Prime Minister's office actually prepared a report that actually laid out a very succinct, detailed plan of how to reduce visitation into Block 1 and spread the visitation amongst those other blocks. So I guess what I'm saying is, if anybody's interested, I would encourage them to go on the internet and look for this plan. If anybody wants a plan, they can message me and I can tell you what the exact name of the plan is. And just keep in mind that if we push for the implementation of the plan that was set out to reduce the visitation on Block 1, I am fairly positive, despite all the political interference and other negative factors, that we can actually get Block 1 relatively under control. And I know it's not something that people would like to talk about as much as they should, but I really think it's something that we should address given the time that we're in now. This is the time where we should have a big reset on the protected area.
You say not something people want to talk about, but in the end, environmental conservation is something that has to be spoken about, but is Absolutely. A very touchy topic because of the fact that it's such like a niche, because it's not a majority. And that's where talking about it and getting things pushed through is difficult. But if we all work together and create awareness and then talk about things like we are doing and promoting things, that is where we can drive change.
Absolutely. And I 100% agree.
Definitely Block 1 is one of those places. I mean, 300 jeeps a session is not something that is sustainable.
And that's on average, you know, sometimes during the holiday periods, we can get up to 700, 800.
That's exactly what I was telling you earlier before we did get on this, that we need to find a way, not just talking about Yala, because Yala can go into one whole live session in itself. Yeah. Whereas here we're just trying to create that awareness about the protected areas across our country and what we can do. Maybe we'll do specifics if people do want it to happen. And we'll move on into that in the next live session, moving up east.
Yeah, and also, you know, for all of you who enjoy visiting the protected areas in the region that we talked about today, give some thought to trying and figuring out if you want to know. I mean, we can always tell you, we know where the protected areas are. And if you have the opportunity, just visit those other protected areas. Get some photography done. Put that on social media. Show people the beauty of these other protected areas. I think it's very worthwhile. And I also feel that once we spread that awareness, we can fully comprehend the scale of what we're dealing with and then approach it in a positive manner. I think that's what I believe.
Definitely. Exactly. That's another key thing. If we can spread that awareness and get people to know about things, that's why lots of posts that you and I do go out to the less known areas like Udawalawe North and all of that and let people know about it and try and get that love for nature and the want to visit these different protected areas and not just the national parks. And Absolutely. From that, people can fall back in love with nature. And like you said, this is probably the best time for it to happen because everything is closed down and it's getting that revamp that it needs as such and the rest. And then when we do go out, maybe not go to these over-visited areas, but go to new places and try those out and then share that. And from that, move on. And anyway, now we better stop and keep it to a minimum and move up east on the next session.
Yes.
I'm
So
with it.
we will see you all in the next session for Sri Lanka's Eastern Terrestrial Protected Areas.
All right. I will see you next week.
Till
Oh,
next
this.
time. Yeah.